joining us today. David, the screen is yours.
All right, thank you, Ari, and thank you, Sherelle. I was going to start everyone by wishing everyone a happy new year and acknowledging that it may be a little bit dissonant to be studying history in the midst of our period of spiritual renewal. I was going to suggest that it actually might make a nice balance, that the high holiday season is one of not only spiritual renewal, but also us renewing our engagement with being Jewish. You know, what does it mean to be a Jew at some level? And history has a lot to say in that regard. So welcome to the first in a five-session class on all of Jewish history. It will serve as a general introduction, but with a twist, and that twist is the particular lens through which we're going to talk about history, and that is the overarching theme of history and memory, which I will explain shortly. And secondly, today we'll also start with our first more specific theme, which is the theme of what we mean by the phrase "the Jewish people," Jewish peoplehood as a concept, as a form of Jewish identity and something that shapes the Jewish experience. So that's what we're doing today. To start, I will open with asking all of you a question, a little bit of a pop quiz, if you will. I wonder if people will have a number in mind if I ask you, how old is Jewish history? And I just think of a number. It's almost, I feel like I'm doing a magic trick. Does everyone have a number in mind? Okay, now that you have an estimate in your head, I will tell you that the correct answer. Yeah, so someone wrote 5785, which is a really interesting non-historical answer to the question. Obviously, that is the period of time that the rabbis, maybe it's not obvious, the year that we are currently celebrating was instituted, that numbering was instituted by the ancient rabbis to describe not the history of the Jews, but rather the history of the world. In other words, the world was created 5785 years ago, according to the rabbis. We'll come back to that perspective. But no, that's certainly not my perspective. My question is, how old is Jewish history? And my answer is almost exactly 200 years. It was in the 1820s, exactly 200 years ago, that a modern scientific academic field of Jewish historical study was introduced. This is something that has garnered much commentary since the publication of a landmark work about 40 years ago. It's already that old, my goodness. And that's this book, Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, the great Jewish historian at Columbia University for many years. This book, published in 1982, became an instant classic. And in it, amongst other things, Yerushalmi, and I always like to also ask my audiences, his name is Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. Where do you think he grew up? And the answer is the Bronx. He was a nice Jewish boy from the Bronx who later Hebraicized his name to Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. But Yerushalmi describes at great length in this book the almost total lack of Jewish historical writing in Jewish experience, with one major exception. There was, in the first century CE, a commander in the Jewish revolt against Rome who later abandoned his own forces and escaped to the Roman side. Lived out his life in Rome. His name was Josephus Flavius, was his Latin name, who became the first and only great Jewish historian, writing as far as he could, to the extent possible at the time, the most accurate accounting of who the Jews are and what they have experienced, and also to some degree the most objective. There was a bias, there always is, but the attempt, what makes something history is the attempt to be as exacting as scientific and objective as possible, to be neutral in terms of taking sides and the like. And that's the nature of historical inquiry and historical writing. And once again, it's only for about 200 years that we Jews have been doing that vis-a-vis our own past, our own historical experience. As Yerushalmi explains in great detail, filling in the gap, or filling in the vacuum rather, during all of these centuries, well, how did Jews think about their past? What was their mode of remembering their own experience? Well, it wasn't history. It was a word he introduces or utilizes here. The word he uses is memory. There is a Jewish collective memory, which is very much part of the Jewish experience. It is today, it exists side by side with history. Sometimes they're in tension, sometimes not. And that dichotomy, that duality of history vis-a-vis memory, I still have yet to fully explicate how they're different and so forth. But that's the basic approach we'll be taking throughout. We'll be looking at a number of major themes in the Jewish historical experience. And for each one, we'll talk about, well, what is the Jewish memory? And then we'll contrast that with what Jewish history has to say about the same set of issues or the same episodes or events and the like. Let's just very briefly, I say it's 200 years old. It was a trick question. I'm sure many of you had numbers in the thousands of years, and we will talk about that today in terms of when the Jews as a people originated, and that gives us a kind of a length of time for their historical experience. But the 200 years refers to a period in 1820s Germany when a group of young Jewish enlightened Jews begin to, with their university, now that they haven't been fully emancipated in Germany by that time, but in the hopes of gaining their full equality, their civil emancipation, they are attending a university. They are applying the perspectives and the methodologies of the emerging world of modern science and inquiry. They're applying that to the Jewish condition, and they found a new movement, which in German was called the Wissenschaft des Judentum, which often is translated as the science of Judaism, but really it meant the scientific inquiry into the Jewish experience. Today we call it modern Jewish studies. It's an academic field, and there are now thousands of university professors who are representatives of this. It began with just a handful of young men in 1820s Germany. One of them was named Isaac Marcus Jost, who during the course of the 1820s wrote the first, he attempted to write the first comprehensive history of the Jews. He would later be succeeded by fellow European Jews such as Heinrich Gretz, and later Simon Dubnov, and later others as well, until once again we today have thousands and thousands of people in this field, myself included. So it begins relatively recently, and yet it should be added that during just 200 years, there's been tremendous progress made. And it is ongoing. Every decade or two, there's a new cycle, a new revolution in thinking, a new way of understanding the Jewish past. And we have by now accumulated a tremendous literature and field of knowledge in this subject. I would even argue that is our latest and most recent Torah. Torah in the broad sense of a Jewish wisdom book, a guide to Jewish living. It is modern Jewish studies writ large, and specifically Jewish history, that is the modern Torah of the Jews. And that's the one side of the history memory coin that we'll be talking about today. Let's to illustrate, to give you a better sense of what we're talking about, let's take an example you're all familiar with, and that is the example of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. The rabbis, in introducing the subject of Hanukkah in the Mishnah, which was composed in the 3rd century CE, in the 200s, around the year, the year 200 is usually the date we cite for the Mishnah. At that moment, the rabbis say, what is Hanukkah? And by which they meant, what is the reason for Hanukkah? Their answer was the one you are all most familiar with, and that is that after the great Maccabean victory against the Hellenistic rulers, they recaptured the temple, which had been defiled, and they went to relight the oil lamps of the temple, but there was only oil enough for one day. What would they do? And miraculously, the oil lasted for 8 days. It was a literal divine intervention, a miracle. The oil lasted for long enough for them to make new oil, and therefore the day was saved. So that's the traditional story. We have a wonderful ritual of lighting the Hanukkah menorah, Chanukiah, over 8 days to commemorate that miracle, that great miracle. Nes gadol haya po. You say that in Israel, a great miracle happened here. In the diaspora, we say Nes gadol haya sham, there. In either case, it's a celebration of the miracles, a celebration of God's salvation, saving the day, God's intervention in our world. That was the rabbi's version. Now, it's a beautiful story, and it is one we all learned as children, and we all will continue to tell our children, and that will always be the case. As long as Jews and Judaism are in existence, we will tell and retell that story and celebrate a holiday based around it. But that's not history. The miracle of the oil, from the secular point of view, the scientific point of view of modern historians and history, was a lovely story, and that's all. That's not what actually happened. There were historical events that led the ancient group called Israel to create a new holiday called Hanukkah. We have more or less contemporaneous books, the Book of the Maccabees, which tell this story. And that story they tell says nothing about the miracle of oil. Instead, it tells the story of what begins as a kind of civil war within the ancient Jewish community between the more traditional Jews, who will be represented by the Maccabees, and the more Hellenized Jews, the more assimilated Jews in Jerusalem in the administration of the Hellenistic Greek rulers. And there will be a civil war into which the Hellenistic ruler Antiochus will be brought in as well. And it is that war which the Maccabees successfully win. They reassert the tradition of the Judaism of the time. They retake the Holy Temple and institute a new holiday, which, by the way, is the first post-biblical holiday instituted, not according to the Torah, not commanded by God, but rather one that we created to commemorate this amazing, victorious moment. That's the history in a nutshell. The essence of it is actually an internal conflict within Jewish life. It goes to the disunity and discord between Jews. And therefore, that's one reason the later rabbis, writing over 300 years later, right? Those events occurred in the 2nd century BCE. The rabbis will not be writing until the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. So it's at least 200, if not 300 years later, when the rabbis are not very comfortable with that historical explanation. For one thing, they were living in the Roman Empire at that time, and to celebrate a successful rebellion, a military victory against foreign rulers, that was just a little too uncomfortable for them in the context of the Roman Empire. And 2, they wanted to emphasize God's role. The Maccabees, while they certainly believed in God, they were quite happy to celebrate their own victory, this worldly success, and God's role in it was not of the essence, whereas the rabbis would reassert that. So again, very in a this. I'm just using Hanukkah to illustrate this tension between the historical events, which today have been reconstructed. The story I told, by the way, has only been fully retold and reimagined by modern day historians within these last 200 years. For all of those intervening centuries, the story we told was the one given to us by the rabbis, the story of the miracle of the oil, and that should be understood not as history, but as Jewish memory. Our religious tradition, the parts of our tradition that talk about, that teach what our past was, are not to be considered history, but rather a much better word is memory. One could also use the word myth, but unfortunately, the word myth has some negative connotations. Memory is a much better term because it's not positive or negative necessarily, but I want to argue that between history and memory, one is now faced, as a modern Jew, one is faced with perhaps a dilemma. Well, which of those two versions do I choose? Do I go with the Civil War, Hellenistic Jews against traditional Jews, or do I go with the miracle performed by God? Right? That's the choice between us. I think you'll agree if you think about Hanukkah, you think about the way in which you would like to see Jewish schools today convey this story and teach this aspect of the Jewish experience. I think you'll all agree that both serve a purpose. Both are still valuable. And to choose one over the other would be unfortunate. And I want to extend that to the rest of our discussion. We'll be looking at any number of other such contrasts between the historical version and the memory version. And in almost every case, with one key exception, I am going to argue that they are both of value and should both be retained. One could certainly choose history and reject memory, right? That's kind of very secular, kind of an atheistic rejection of Judaism in a way, right? As a modern person, one could accept memory and ignore history. That's more of a traditionalist, almost fundamentalist way of engaging with the Jewish tradition. But much better in my view, is understanding and embracing the tension between them, understanding that it's a creative, dynamic tension, and that both play a valued role as long as you don't confuse one for the other. They both can be held at the same time. The moment you begin thinking memory is historical, the moment you begin taking it literally, makes it difficult to hold both. But if you understand these are two very different modes of understanding our past, of interpreting our past, both with value, well, that's what modern Judaism is. The additive experience of modernity and traditional Judaism, they can be joined together and balanced and harmonized. And that's what we're talking about at the end of the day. The one key exception that I mentioned, I will come to it toward the end of our course, so I will leave you somewhat in suspense. But keep in mind that the basic approach that I'll be taking is that both are good. And so for today's key theme, that you should know that from the start, that in thinking about the value of Jewish peoplehood, I believe once again that both the historical take on it, and the memory version of it, both serve a vital purpose, are both of great value. So let's begin talking about peoplehood in a certain way. Peoplehood, the concept of being a people, is the central theme of the Jewish historical experience, of Jewish history, in that Jewish history is the study of the very long-term, centuries-long-term historical experience of the Jews as a group, the Jews as a people. Right. So at the most basic level, Jewish history is the story of the Jews. And that's our first issue for today is, who are the Jews? Where did they come from? What kind of group are they? And as you're all very well aware, especially in the modern world, this has become a matter of some contentiousness. What kind of group are the Jews? Are they a racial group? Are they not a racial group, but a religion? Are they a national group, a nationality? Are they a culture? Are they a state of mind? Right? There are any number of possibilities that have collided often in the modern world. Different Jews have different ideas of what kind of group the Jews are. Very often outsiders seeing the Jews will either limit their view of us to just one of these aspects of groupiness, or will mistake us for something else. And modern anti-Semitism, to a large degree, was the misconception that Jews are a race. And then it added the fact that they were an inferior, evil race. But seeing Jews in those terms as such a group formed by biological descent and the makeup of their blood and genetics, right? That's a racial idea. That's, for good reason, strongly associated with modern anti-Semitism. Some of these other issues have been championed by various Jewish groups. The idea that Jews are none of those other categories, but only constitute a religion. That is the only valid and accurate way to understand who Jews are. They are adherents of a religion. Well, that was first pushed in the 19th century by a new Jewish movement called Reform Judaism. And that's another lecture. We can come back to it at some point, the modern iterations and arguments around this issue. But for our purposes today, we're going to simply take the historical route and answer the basic question of who are the Jews by doing what is often done to address such a question, and go back to the beginning. When, where, and how did the Jews originate? When did they first become a group? And that origin story will go a long way toward answering this question of what kind of group are they. Now, let's see. Let's start with the memory version, the memory answer to who are the Jews. And for that, I think it's best to go to the quintessential book of Jewish memory, the Torah, as I will discuss next week in our second class, in which we will look much more closely at the history of and the nature of the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. I will make the case, then more in greater detail, that the Torah was not ever intended to be a work of history. It ought not be read by us, therefore, as a work of history. It was intended for something else, serves that other purpose quite admirably. But for our purposes today, let's simply call it a book of memory. To the degree that the Jewish tradition has promoted some version of memory, it all begins with the Torah. So let's start at the beginning of the Jewish memory tradition. And let's see, I want to go to this screen. Okay. Does everyone see that? Is that screen now up? Yeah, okay. This is a passage from the book of Genesis, Bereshit, from the 12th chapter. The first 11 chapters are mainly the story of the creation of the world, of the Garden of Eden, of the story of Noah, right? It's all of those ancient tales. And we get finally in chapter 12 to the beginning of the Jewish story in the parasha, the Torah portion called Lech Lecha, for the first two words, which are often translated as go forth. These are the first words said by God to Abram, who is remembered in Jewish tradition as the first Jew. So what you're looking at, what we're about to read together, is God's very first commandment to the very first Jew. It is, in a powerful sense, the beginning of the Jewish story. Who are the Jews? Well, they come from Abraham, as we'll see. Let me read to you again. This should be fairly familiar to everyone. The Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you." Let the siren go by. Someone's very excited about Abram. This is an extraordinary moment in the biblical narrative. It is the beginning of what will be a more fully developed, fleshed out relationship between this one ancient individual and God. Through this, we will come to develop a new conception of God, different from other ideas of the deity in the ancient world. And for our purpose today, more importantly, it will begin to give us a new idea about what is a Jew. God continues, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. So Abraham is introduced, first of all, as the recipient of the word of God. He's the first prophet in that sense, the first person in the earlier narrative, Noah is in contact with God, and you can suggest a few other cases as well. But Abraham is going to develop this dialogue with God, which will turn him and his progeny and all of his future offspring into a new category, a nation. So according to the biblical account, the Jews overall are a nation, and they all will derive from this one person. If you skip down to verse 7, you see the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will assign this land to your offspring. So from the very beginning of the Abrahamic narrative, the patriarchal narratives, including his children, we have the promise of the land. That's why it's called the promised land. And the promise is made directly to Abraham, but will be toward the benefit of all of his future offspring. And that's the second key element of this. The first being the relationship to God. As this story develops, again, this is all should all be very familiar to all of you. As this tale will develop, it will turn into a more formal arrangement between God and Abram, called in Hebrew a brit, in English a covenant. And that covenant becomes the foundation of the Jewish experience, of the Jewish religious tradition later on, and even more essentially of what it means to be a Jew. To be a Jew, according to this essential text, is to be in some relationship with a covenantal relationship, meaning that God makes certain promises and that the Jew in covenant is obligated to God in certain ways as well. So it is a kind of a deal struck that will have requirements on both sides. And that covenant, that religious relationship between man and God, is the first aspect of being a Jew. I think there are many who would continue to argue today that that is the essence. Everything else is unimportant by comparison, right? That is the key, the end-all be-all to being a Jew, one would say. Certainly a religious Jew nowadays might very well say that. But let's also add to that first element, the religious implications of this. Let's also add the implication of the notion of Abraham being the forefather of a people that will descend from him and his wife Sarah, his child Isaac, his child Jacob. Jacob's name, as you know, will be changed to Israel. His 12 sons will eventually form tribes. Those 12 tribes will come to be known as the children of Israel, which also means they are the grandchildren of Abraham. So the other key aspect of the Jewish memory of Jewish peoplehood is that we Jews are family. We are an extended family, a lineage. Sorry, wait a second. Okay, stop share. Here we go. Okay. So that powerful passage, and obviously this is something you've heard, you may have studied in school, you've heard sermons about. This is one of the most important moments in the Torah, in the biblical narrative, and there are many other things that could be said about it. But what I'd like to emphasize is it asserts from the very start that the first Jew, and therefore all subsequent Jews, are in covenant with God. That's number one. And number two is all Jews are descendants of the very first Jew. We are a very extended family. So the spiritual connection, number one, and the familial nature of being a Jew, number two. And I hope you can see that in both cases, they both bring tremendous value to the modern day condition of Jews and say an awful lot to us about what it could mean or should mean to be a Jew. And they're both very, very pregnant in how much else will come out of that. Now, that's the memory of peoplehood. The problem from the historical point of view is that we modern day historians and anthropologists and sociologists, in other words, the social sciences, now understand the historical development of nations, of national peoples, of ethnic groups, if you will, in a very different way. We understand the way in which nations come into being as, first of all, a gradual process, and secondly, as a kind of transformative process, that whatever group we're talking about was originally some other group, and then for various reasons over the course of time develops a new identity and comes to see itself and be seen by others as a new group with a new name. And that's a gradual process. It doesn't happen overnight. It certainly doesn't happen with one individual. An individual can establish a religion. Muhammad is the founder of Islam. Joseph Smith is the founder of Mormonism. Those religions and many others can begin with one person. But a people is a much more complex historical phenomenon and is subject to the rules I cited earlier. Let me just give you a simple example. Most of us on this call are Americans. We are part of the American people. Would it make any sense to you if I asked you, well, who was the first American? Who was the very first person who founded this idea? And if from that moment onward, all his various compatriots became like him or her American. And can you imagine telling the story of the history of America in that way? It wouldn't make any sense. We all know that a group of colonists from Europe, mostly English colonists, were living on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. And for a while, or century or two or more, they thought of themselves as still English. They were colony of England, and they were still subjects of the crown. Their identity as a group was English colonists. Well, at what point and in what way did they change into being no longer English, but rather something new, American? The answer is it took place over the course of decades and decades. It has a moment, a creation moment, the American Revolution, but still it's part of a longer process. And that's the way peoples come into being. So that's the first principle in addressing this question of how does history answer the question of who are the Jews? Well, they were some ancient group who came into being over the course of time. Now, to some degree, that does correspond to the biblical tale, and that Abraham is not only the beginning of the story, and obviously his descendants will go down to Egypt, be enslaved, come back. They will leave Egypt through the Exodus and then enter the land through a process of conquest and settlement. That's the biblical story. Well, I'm afraid to tell you that modern day history tells a very different story. And the assumption is that these ancient narratives may have some kernel of truth, certainly. There certainly may have been some group that came out of Egypt and settled in what was then called the land of Canaan, and they became part of the beginnings, the origins of this new group. But the problem is that the biblical narratives, again, as we'll talk at greater length next week, the biblical narratives will be written centuries, many centuries after the events they purport to describe. And therefore, they may have tremendous value as spiritual narratives, as allegorical narratives, as the foundation of Jewish culture in so many ways. These stories are who we have become, who we are, but they are memory, not history. They should not be taken literally, that Abraham actually lived in this way and said these words and experienced what is described of him. Rather, modern day historians put that aside, the much later biblical narrative, and instead they use the various tools of modern day inquiry into the ancient world to try to recover and recapture where the ancient Israelites did come from. Now, first question is, well, where, if at all, does this group called Israel They weren't yet called Jews, right? That will be a later name. And again, a good example of how groups and group identity evolves over time, right? A group called Israel will later evolve into a group called Jews, right? There may be all sorts of connections between them, but the name changes, and that tells you something about a change in identity. But the key question here is, who was ancient Israel? And the first thing we do is we look to the general archaeological record to see where, if at all, there is mention of them outside of the Bible. Again, we'll be looking at this next week. The Torah is going to be written by Jews for Jewish consumption. It is a creation of Jewish culture and identity, but is not a historical record per se. So where do we go to begin putting together a historical record? And the first answer is Egyptian archaeology in particular. As you're probably aware, ancient Egypt has become an extraordinary source for our knowledge of the ancient world, for a very simple reason: is they kept records. They evolved early on a form of writing called hieroglyphics, and you're looking here at the relevant hieroglyphic find. This was discovered, I think, 1898, late 19th century, in the ancient city of Thebes, further down the Nile, further south in the Nile. Today resides in the Cairo Museum. And this is known to archaeologists and to Jewish historians as the Merneptah Stela. Stela is another word for monument. It's a victory monument. Merneptah was the name of the pharaoh who lived in the late 13th century. The Merneptah Stela is usually dated to 1207. The reign of Merneptah is usually said to end in 1203. So this was from his reign. And it is a listing of all of the great victories, all of the great successes accomplished by his administration. Let's look at the text of it. Once again, everyone sees this? Yeah, okay. So this is the first time that we find the word Israel in the ancient record. If it can be dated, and the dates here are a little bit off, so ignore that. But if it can be dated to 1207, that simply tells us something was very powerful when it was discovered, that Israel as a group, as a distinctive, recognizable group, existed by that date. And therefore, they must have originated sometime before 1207 BCE. So that's the first starting point. Right? That little bit of information, when discovered by a British archaeologist in 1898, was earth-shattering. It was the first time that any aspect of the Bible was authenticated. Imagine the excitement. Let's look at the text of it. Merneptah boasts essentially the princes of all those enemies lie prostrate. They are suing for peace. Not one lifts his head among the nine bows. The nine bows, the traditional Egyptian name for its enemies. And then the nine will shift from time to time. But traditionally in ancient Egyptian culture, they have nine traditional enemies known as the nine bows. Destruction for Tenu. Tenu refers to east of Egypt, the Libyan area of North Africa. Hatti is pacified. Hatti refers to the Hittite kingdom of Anatolia, what's today Turkey, of Asia Minor, north of Egypt. Canaan, to the northeast of Egypt, is plundered with every evil, and the rest of the place names are specific city-states and their peoples, their associated peoples, that too have been vanquished, utterly defeated by the great pharaoh Merneptah. Ashkelon is taken. Gezer is captured. Some of you may know there's a kibbutz called Gezer that sits right next to the ancient Tel, the ancient archaeological mound of ancient Gezer. Was a major city on the coastal plain in that period. Yanoam is made non-existent. And then we get to the key element of this. Israel, too, lies desolate. And then the great irony, one of the great flubs in the history of ancient Egypt, its seed is no more. Now, that was, of course, aspirational, right? That was the intention of defeating enemies, that they would be wiped off the map. But as we know, Israel and later Jews will have a much longer history and will go on to thrive and survive and live for many, many centuries to come. Huru has become a widow for Egypt. All the lands in there, Huru is that entire area of what later will be called Syria and Palestine, that general area of the map. All the lands in their entirety are pacified. Everyone who was a nomad has been curbed by King Merneptah. Now that's interesting. Everyone who was a nomad begins to give you, that's a hint at least, as to who the ancient Israelites were or may have been. And in fact, one of the leading theories, let's stop the share, okay. One of the leading theories that archaeologists have developed is that the ancient Israelites were some ethnic group that either found its way into Canaan and settled there, or even may have developed in place. So let's run briefly through some of those key theories. One is there was a major incursion or invasion of this area of what today we call the Middle East by a seafaring group called the Hyksos in the 13th and 12th centuries. Now, that's right around the same time that ancient Israel probably came into being, right? If 1207 is the latest, then certainly that century, the 13th century, is a prime suspect for when Israel came into being. And it's more or less the same time that there is, or actually the Hyksos were a little bit early, I take it out, sorry. In the 14th century, the 1300s, is when the Hyksos invasion of Egypt took place. And there have been various theories that there may be some connection between our story of enslavement and exodus from Egypt. So the idea of there being social and political turmoil in ancient Egypt, and there may be some connection to the Hyksos. There was probably a connection between that foreign invasion and the development of an early form of Egyptian monotheism, the cult of Akhenaton. There may be some connection there, and there may be part of the actual story of ancient Israel might have developed out of that. That theory is no longer widely held, but certainly the Hyksos go to the fact that there was, at this moment, the 12th century is the end of the Iron Age and the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. It was a period of transformation in general. That may be. And the more common theory, the theory that for a long time was the going theory, was that rather than the ancient Israelites being invaders, raiders from outside, they were in fact, as the Merneptah stela suggests, they were in fact originally nomads who infiltrated the land of Canaan at various times in various places and settled there and ended up settling there and developing a more permanent culture and identity. That's certainly possible. There is a group in the archaeological record, and this one has intrigued historians for quite a long time. And the name of that ancient group were the Hapiru, sometimes spelled with an H, Hapiru, sometimes just A, sometimes instead of the P sound with a B, Abiru. And then you start hearing Habiru sounds an awful like Hebrew. And it is still possible that there is a connection between the Apiru, who pop up for a number of centuries in all sorts of records of the ancient Near East, as a group on the fringes of society. They were not part of any mainstream society or culture, but they were kind of in a little bit like our image of gypsies in Europe or the Bedouin in the Middle East, people who were nomadic and lived on the fringes outside of the laws and norms of regular society. The Apiru will pop up quite a bit. And again, it is possible that certain bands of Apiru found their way into Canaan, the land of Canaan, before it was renamed the land of Israel, before later renamed other things. And that is where we will see the development of a new group called Israel. Again, it's still possible. There's another group similar to that called the Shosu, which are sometimes thought to be another possibility of infiltrating nomads, and that is the origins of the Israelites. Related to this is the idea that there were peasant rebels from the larger cities in Canaan, which were on the coastal plain, and that these peasant rebels, for one reason or another, fled from the cities and resettled up in the highlands of central Israel today, and that they were the first Israelites. This is a related theory. What is the most current, most widely accepted theory nowadays is one that I would recommend. This is a few decades old already, but it is a very accessible, popular telling of this story of the findings of modern biblical archaeology. It's entitled The Bible Unearthed, Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel and the Origin of its Sacred Texts. I'm reading it reversed. Is that reversed for you as well? The authors are Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, an Israeli and an American Jewish archaeologist who teamed up to both summarize what are the findings of contemporary archaeology and to promote their own theories as well. And it's their theory that has gained widespread currency. Let me first tell you that one of the stories they tell is the revolution that has occurred in biblical archaeology since the turning point of 1967 with the Six-Day War and the Israeli conquest of what some Jews call Judea and Samaria, others will call the occupied territories, others will call the West Bank. That region, that central spine of the land of Canaan and later the land of Israel, is where it turns out the ancient Israelites originated. And it was only after 1967 that Israeli archaeologists had access to those sites to begin digging and retelling and recovering the actual historical origins of people of late Bronze Age and early Iron Age villages and settlements in that area. In that key century, the 13th century BCE, once again, a transitional period, the end of the Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. It's in that moment that the archaeological finds have discovered approximately 250 new villages in that area. In other words, these areas were sparsely settled prior to that period. And suddenly, in historical time, over the course of a century or two, a new population emerges into the picture. And modern day archaeologists and historians like Finkelstein and Silberman have argued fairly persuasively that these were the first Israelites. Now, it is possible, as they say, as they add, that there was some outside influence. For example, if a group of runaway slaves had joined them from Egypt, they may well have brought with them certain new religious ideas and even social and political philosophies of equality and the like that may have influenced the origins of what will later become biblical culture, biblical law, and the like. But the majority experience of those people who will be the first Jews, the ancient Israelites, were simply former nomads who settled in the highlands, ostensibly to be far away from the dangerous cities of Canaan, and who formed small towns, villages based upon a combination of herding and farming. And it's that moment of the development of a new society that we'll see will be the context for the development of a new culture, identity, a new people. The people of Israel, like every other people, are born collectively and over the course of time, and in such a way that that the historical lens has to slow it down. Nothing happens overnight in a moment, which is more dramatic, and therefore, that attitude finds its way into our Torah. But history says, let's slow things down and let's look at what we actually have evidence for. So the first Israelites were this group that appears during that key century in that particular area. Now, we have yet to talk about their particular religious culture. Early on, there was little, not only did they not find weaponry and other signs of warfare, which goes to their peaceful settlement, generally speaking, right? They didn't feel they were under attack, they were under threat from invaders, so they didn't have fortifications, they didn't need weaponry and a military force, right? But neither do they find much in the way of religious shrines and amulets and certainly no documents. So this was a fairly primitive culture by comparison to who they would become in just a few short centuries, right? The Torah being the major, this is now foreshadowing next week, the Torah being the major creative production of ancient Israel that will both reflect the emerging religious culture and to a large degree shape it. That only comes in approximately the 5 centuries from 900 to 400. That's 5 centuries. That's when the Torah, when what we think of as ancient Israelite culture, which will evolve into Judaism, that's when it comes into being. But that is at least 300 years, if not more, after the origins of the group as a people. Very different story from the one told in the Bible of the judges and the conquests and the military conflicts. It's a very different story. And here again, I would suggest to you that it, like the story of Abraham and the covenant, this more scientific, more modern way of thinking about the history of the Jews, gradual, evolving over time, peaceful, right? Generally speaking, largely indigenous, right? Those nomads were, in a way, they were Canaanites. They did not, for the most part, come from abroad. They were more or less a local population moving to another part of the country and reshaping and redefining their collective identity. Very different story from what we have in the Bible. And I think what's useful here, especially given today's political climate, is it roots us in actual history, right? In other words, as we will do next week, to see who wrote the Torah, when, where, and how it was composed is going to tie us to it that much more powerfully, because it is not based upon religious faith, but it's based upon scientific research. And I think that it is certainly helpful to all of us as modern day Jews who are in some way the products of this very lengthy historical experience to understand the roots we come from. And those roots are not, Judaism certainly will be singular in various ways, but the people who will develop Judaism are an ancient people like many others. Right? There's nothing immediately singular, chosen by God, chosen about ancient Israel, about our ancestors, our origins, but it's kind of historically normal in a way. I think there's some value in that. It balances that sense of Jewish singularity and distinctiveness. There is some of that. We will come to that in our historical experience. But there's also just normalcy. We were indigenous Canaanites who developed a new culture. Now, in closing, let me just share with you, again, I want to recommend this book. It's a wonderfully well-told encapsulation of the archaeological record that we now have. But just one item jumps out. It's kind of cute. That's why I want to share it with you. And that is in determining that those original Israelites were essentially similar. They were exactly the same as the lowland Canaanites. Again, the lowland Canaanites had larger buildings, had more armament, right? It was a more developed culture in a way. These hilltop villages were more rural, more pastoral. But one chief difference did jump out at a modern day archaeologist in that in digging up the garbage pits of the Canaanite cities in the lowlands and the Israelite villages in the highlands, both of them threw out a lot of bones of the animals they consumed. And the Canaanites, it turns out, loved pig. They found a tremendous amount of pig bones in the Canaanite cities. Up in the hills, no pig bones. Now, whether or not that's the origin of the kashrut system that we will later develop is speculative, but it is certainly evocative given that we now stand at the end of this historical continuum, and our perspective is with the full knowledge of Jewish ritual, Jewish law, and the incredibly intricate complex that is Judaism. We're now aware of that, but there was this ancient group who lived before any of that. And so it raises fascinating questions about where the stories came from, the story of Moses and the Exodus, where the ancient tales of the patriarchs came from, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Perhaps they were different ancestors of different tribes. And in bringing together the tribes and in revising the stories, they posited that they were in fact related, that they were all one family in order to unify a group. That's why we tell stories. That's why we have memory. It brings us together. It gives us a common identity. And that is certainly Jews amongst all the peoples of the world are long-term experts in telling our story and building our community and solidifying our unity. And I hope that today's session helped all of you to solidify a little bit more your understanding of your own history, your own past. And with that, I will open up to questions. And do we have time left?
Yeah, we'll go into bonus time just for.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I took up a little more time than usual.
It's okay. It was terrific. Lots of positive comments. People enjoyed it. Very clear. I guess here's a few notes. Number one is CSP has a store online. You may or may not know. In that store, we have a special Passover T-shirt, and it's the Merneptah stele with that language on the T-shirt. So I'll put that in the follow-up. Number two,
I'd love one. Thank you.
Okay, you just email me what size you want. I doing a lot of American history with my kids who are 6 and 8 because they're studying American history in school. And Benjamin Franklin is probably the closest we have to Abraham, actually. And he does have this moment. He has this moment in everything I've seen, if you watch it, where he turns. You can see him turn from a British subject to an American.
I see your point. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. That's nice. That's nice.
So very interesting.
Of course, Ken Burns' series on Franklin further deepens that idea.
I watched that. Yes.
Let me take that and reiterate the distinction between being the founding father of a people and being the founding father of its collective ethos. So I think while you're right that he transformed his own identity, and that can be seen as a precedent. I think more importantly, Franklin is one of the key founders, creators of Americanism, in the same way that Abraham and Moses were founders of Judaism. That's different from being the first Jew, right? So that's the distinction I'm trying to make, and we'll pick up that thread again next week, of course.
So you're welcome. History versus memory. I went to an Orthodox Jewish day school. So of course we studied, which was very funny because we studied science and we studied literature and we did math. But when it comes to Jewish studies, we only studied memory. So I should have put a trigger warning here that this program may not be for you if you believe that the Torah was dictated by God to Moses and written. That is a very strong mythology that I personally, it's a nice mythology to have, like with a capital M, important memory. But what you're talking about is a very different understanding of Judaism.
It helps when I used to teach this to college students, and invariably there would be Orthodox students in the class, and I was worried about them. I apologize to anyone in this group that I didn't take care of in the same way. But what I used to say to them, I used to pull them aside at the beginning and say, listen, this may be difficult for you if you have a yeshiva education. This may challenge certain assumptions of yours. I want you to think of it as learning a new language. Like, you can keep your original language, but this language of modern scientific history is another way of talking and thinking. And, ideally that softened the blow a little bit. I don't know if it really worked, but
I do appreciate what you were doing today, which is the balance. You weren't disregarding memory. You were talking about the importance of memory, but also the importance of modern thinking and that they go together.
And by the way, so in terms of how all of this jives with our modern day Judaism, you should all know, and this is one of my pet peeves, those of you in Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist congregations, there's everything other than Orthodox, and even to some degree Orthodoxy, modern Orthodox, YU, it would be included. every form of modern Judaism teaches this stuff to its rabbis in rabbinical school, right? They all know this, but how often do they talk about it from the Bema? There was a famous event in Los Angeles where a great rabbi named David Wolpe talked about this after this book came out. He read this book and he reported it to his very large, prominent congregation in LA. They almost rode him out of town on a rail. It caused a firestorm of controversy. And so I guess I should have softened it by introducing it.
Well, I think that was because Rabbi Wolpe gave it as a Passover Devar Torah to question whether Passover happened.
But his point was precisely mine, that the statement, the Exodus may never have happened historically, that statement is irrelevant. We celebrate and tell that story for reasons completely different than establishing history. That's not why we tell that story. So he made that distinction between history and memory, even if he didn't use those terms. He made that very clearly, and most modern day rabbis will do that as well. So, my hope is that this is not as controversial as it might be. Certainly in Orthodox circles, it would be difficult, and we'll be talking much more about that next week when we talk about Torah. Right? Just to give you a little forspice, the memory is that Torah is from Sinai. Torah Sinai, divine. That means divine revelation. It will not shock you at this point to hear that modern day historians tell the different story. And that's what we'll be talking about next week.
I will tell you that my family, who is Orthodox, did not enjoy my questioning of the historicity of the Exodus story during our Passover Seder many years ago. So let's see a few other quick notes. When you talked about the Torah as memory, but there is historicity in there. There's got to be, doesn't mean everything happened the way it did, but let's talk about Rosh Hashanah, right? We have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Well, first of all, again, that's next week's class, number one. And number two, keep in mind the Hebrew Bible is 30 some odd books, right? And as you work your way through the Bible, it becomes more and more historical. In other words, no one thinks that Adam and Eve is historical, right? But the question is, to what degree is Abraham? To what degree is Moses? To what degree is King David? And the easy answer is, well, it becomes more historically accurate as you move further on. So the end of the Bible is more or less contemporaneous to those events and can be used by the historian who has to read, sometimes read carefully, but still those are describing events that happened recently. When the psalmist, I'm
so we'll get there. My only point was that there are stories about, for example, in the Chumash about the high priest and going into the Holy of Holies there's references to Rosh Hashanah as the Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur. So, and I would assume there is some historicity to that actually happened. Absolutely. As opposed to the Noah and the flood, which my mom insists happened, by the way, because I always ask her whenever I see her. So all the animals are on the boat, Mom? I mean, all of them? They got the polar bears there. They got the whatever. Anyway.
If you want, I can give your mom a talk.
Yes, please do. DNA.
You have to talk to my mom.
Right.
Not her.
Right. DNA studies. So I think it was either Jeff Kaufman or Mary Kraft asked the question. So what is DNA studies? How does that help us understand the origins?
Great question. It could have been part of today's talk. Absolutely. I think if we were to trace this issue, or I focused on the very beginning today, and the nature of the Jews as a group has lots of corollary issues. One of them being what is the actual genetic relationship between modern Jews and ancient Jews. And as you know, there's been a lot of work done in this in the last couple of decades. And there are absolutely genetic ties between some Jews and that ancient world. Some of our genetic makeup ties us back to that era. The key thing to keep in mind is that it's a very, very long history. And over the course of that history, a lot of Jews left, assimilated, right? You've got whole groups of South Americans and Spanish with Jewish blood, so to speak, right? So a lot of Jews left. And then conversely, a lot of non-Jews entered, right? Through intermarriage and other forms of absorption. Every one of us, our family tree has plenty of non-Jewish entries, right? So, none of us in the modern day is 100% ancient Israelite. Couldn't possibly exist, given the other image to have in mind is that the basic genetic tree, which multiplies into the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of ancestors, right? There's no way that any one of us can have all Jewish origins, right? So just mathematically, it doesn't compute. And the historical reality is that it's been, there's a great phrase in the Torah about the group that comes out of Egypt, that they were a mixed multitude. And whatever that's describing means that it wasn't just the enslaved Israelites, but others joined them. And that's actually prescient of the future, that others will become Jewish. In certain cases, entire populations may become Jewish, such as the Khazar kingdom and other things like that. So the longer history of the definition of and the boundaries of the Jewish people is a much more complicated story. I guess we really didn't have time to tell today, but thank you for that question to give me the chance to make that point.
Thank you. The last question is about Israel Finkelstein. So my understanding is he's a very controversial archaeologist, right? He's not a beloved person. And is that because of his theories or because of his personality? Can you, we'll end on that one, I guess.
So yeah, he's got a bombastic personality. He has a lot of enemies, and part of the way these rivalries get expressed is, no, you're full of it. You don't know what you're talking about, right? So he's certainly been challenged, but he is still considered one of the leading figures in the Israeli field of biblical archaeology. And it's not just him, right? He is, in this book, representing an entire field. So there may be some idiosyncratic slants here, but overall, he is representative. And if you want to learn more about this, there was a great New Yorker article. I believe the author's name was Ruth Margalit. Ari, if you find this, you can put it on the bibliography. That was a really nice review of this book, and it gave you that whole background of all the interpersonal intrigue and drama around this guy. He's one of those larger than life figures. So yeah, there is controversy, but there's much less controversy about the issues at hand. It's more personality. Yeah, I would say.
Well, thank you. Well, it's been a trying day. I understand things are a little calmer in Israel
Back to reality.
Now. So
yeah.
Thank you for taking us away from all that for about an hour. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll look forward to studying with you more over the next 4 weeks. I wish everybody a Shana Tova. May it be a much better year for all of us and our families and friends in Israel. And take care. We'll see you guys soon.